Welcome to my channel The Dark Slave. Today's story brings us to 1861, to a woman named Hagar Ashford. A towering black woman, far too intelligent to ever submit. Her will was what they tried to break. Her mind was what they tried to silence. Instead, they ended up selling her 12 times. This story is not easy. Pause for a moment. Listen closely. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're listening from. Your voice helps keep these lives remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the winter of 1861, on a freezing December day, a woman stood on a Virginia auction block for the 12th time in her life. She stood nearly 6'4", with shoulders broad as a man's, massive hands coiled and strong enough to snap a grown man's neck. But it wasn't her size that made buyers hesitate. It wasn't her strength that made plantation owners whisper warnings across the crowded square. It was her eyes. Those eyes held something no enslaved person was ever supposed to have: calculation, patience, the cold, burning certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and what was coming next. That morning's auctioneer, a man named Samuel Cretin, had been selling human beings for 23 years. He'd seen thousands pass through his hands, watched families torn apart, heard mothers scream as their babies were ripped from their arms. None of it ever troubled him. To Samuel, the enslaved were nothing more than livestock. But this woman troubled him. She had arrived 3 days earlier, brought by a trader from Albemarle County, who seemed almost relieved to be rid of her. When Samuel asked why, the trader just shook his head and said 4 words that would haunt him: "She destroys everything she touches." Samuel laughed at the time. He'd seen strong-willed slaves before, fighters, runners, rebels, and knew how to break them all. A few days in the cellar, a few sessions with the whip, a few examples made of others, everyone broke. But 3 days later, standing on that block, Samuel understood. This woman hadn't tried to run, hadn't fought, hadn't spoken a single word. She just stood there, watching with those terrible eyes. In those 3 days, his best horse broke its leg, his wife discovered his mistress and left him, and his business partner was arrested for forgery. Coincidence, Samuel told himself. Just coincidence. But when he looked into those eyes, he wasn't so sure anymore. Her name was Hagar. She was 41, and she was about to complete a plan that had taken 12 years to execute. This is her story. Hagar Ashford was born in the spring of 1820 on a tobacco plantation called Sweetwater, about 15 miles outside Richmond, Virginia. Her mother, Ruth, was a house slave who worked as a seamstress in the main house. Her father was unknown, though the lighter shade of Hagar's skin suggested what everyone knew but never spoke. Ruth was extraordinary, born in Africa, captured at 12, transported across the Atlantic in the belly of a slave ship. She survived the Middle Passage, the Charleston auction blocks, and 30 years of bondage. And through it all, she held on to something that should have been beaten out of her long ago: her mind. Ruth could read, not just simple words, but complex texts in English and French. She'd learned in secret over many years, stealing moments, a newspaper left on a table, a discarded letter, pages from books used to start fires. Ruth collected words the way others collected moments of rest. Each was precious, each was power. She understood something most never learned: the true chains of slavery were not iron, but ignorance. Masters kept slaves illiterate because reading was the most dangerous weapon a slave could possess, a way to forge passes, understand the law, communicate across distances, and plan. Ruth began teaching Hagar to read when she was just 4. They practiced in the small hours of the night by candlelight, in cramped quarters shared with 6 others. Ruth used a stick to scratch letters into the dirt floor, making Hagar trace them until shapes became sounds, sounds became words, words became meaning. It was the most dangerous thing a slave mother could do. In Virginia, teaching a slave to read meant 39 lashes and possible sale to the deep South for the teacher, the same or worse for the student, harsh punishment for anyone who knew and didn't report it. But Ruth did it anyway, because she understood that knowledge was the only inheritance she could give her daughter. The masters could take everything else, her body, her labor, her dignity, but not what was inside her mind. By 7, Hagar could read better than most white children in the county. By 10, she devoured every book she could get her hands on. By 12, she discovered the library. The master of Sweetwater, Charles Ashford, was a wealthy tobacco planter with over 200 slaves and one of the finest private libraries in Virginia, over 3,000 volumes on philosophy, history, law, mathematics, and science. He was proud of it, considered himself a cultured gentleman. He had no idea his most valuable possession was being consumed by a 12-year-old slave girl. Hagar was chosen for this task because of her size and strength, which allowed her to move heavy furniture and reach high shelves. No one realized she'd turned this chore into an education that would rival any university. She developed a system: each morning, select one book from the shelves, memorize its location, and hide it in her clothing. During the day, between duties, she'd find moments to read in hidden corners. At night, by moonlight or the glow of dying embers. Before dawn, she'd return the book to its exact spot. She read Blackstone on English law, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, histories of Caribbean slave revolts, books on agriculture, medicine, geography, military strategy, everything, consuming knowledge with insatiable hunger. And she remembered everything. Hagar was born with what today would be called a photographic memory. She could look at a page once and recall it perfectly years later. She could hear a conversation and repeat it word for word decades after. Her mind was a vast library of its own, every book, word, and face filed in perfect order, ready to be retrieved. This gift would one day save her life. But first, it would destroy everything she loved. On a humid August morning in 1832, Charles Ashford walked into his library and found Hagar by the window, reading a leather-bound copy of Cicero's Orations in the original Latin. She'd gotten careless. After years of caution, she'd become absorbed in a passage about justice and revenge and hadn't heard his footsteps in the hallway. For a long moment, neither moved. Hagar stood with the book in her hands, watching his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, cold fury. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice quiet but trembling. She said nothing. She'd been caught, and they both knew what that meant. Charles Ashford wasn't cruel by the standards of his time. He rarely whipped his slaves, didn't break up families casually, provided adequate food and clothing, considered himself a Christian and gentleman who believed slavery was a positive good. But what he saw terrified him. This wasn't just a slave who'd learned to read, this was a slave who could read Latin, standing in his library, absorbing his knowledge, thinking thoughts no slave should think. A threat to everything he believed. "Who taught you?" he demanded. Hagar remained silent. She knew her answer would determine not just her fate, but her mother's. If she confessed Ruth taught her, Ruth would be sold to the Deep South, to cotton fields and sugar plantations where slaves were worked to death in years. If she lied, she might protect her mother. But Charles had already figured it out. That night, Ruth was dragged to the whipping post. Every slave was forced to watch as the overseer delivered 39 lashes to her bare back with a cowhide whip weighted with metal. By the 15th lash, she'd stopped screaming. By the 30th, she'd lost consciousness. But punishment wasn't over. The next morning, still bleeding, Ruth was loaded onto a wagon and taken to the Richmond slave market. Charles had decided a literate slave was too dangerous. Ruth had to go. Hagar begged to say goodbye, was denied. Begged to be sold with her mother, denied. Begged to know where Ruth was sent, denied. The last image Hagar ever had of her mother was the wagon disappearing down the dusty road, carrying Ruth to a fate she could only imagine. She never saw her again, never learned where she was sold, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina. The South had swallowed her whole, and there was no way to find her. Hagar was 12, and something inside her died that day, something soft, hopeful, human. It was replaced by something cold, hard, and patient, something that would wait as long as needed and do whatever it took until justice was served. She made a vow, standing in the dust where the wagon had been, staring at the empty road, she would make them pay. Not just Charles Ashford, but all of them, every plantation owner, slave trader, overseer, every white person who'd participated in this monstrous system. She would find a way to make them all pay. She was 12, and she'd just declared war. For the next 5 years, Hagar bided her time. She was more careful now, never letting anyone see her read, never revealing the library locked inside her mind. To overseers and other slaves, she was just another field hand, strong, quiet, obedient. But inside, she was planning. She studied the plantation's operations with the intensity she'd once applied to Cicero and Blackstone, how tobacco was grown, harvested, sold, the names of buyers and prices, the routes to market and overseer schedules, the rhythms so thoroughly she could predict what would happen months in advance. And she learned the weaknesses. Every system has them. Charles Ashford ran his plantation like a military operation, but rigidity created predictability, and predictability, opportunity. The overseer, Jeremiah Tate, was a drunkard who spent every Saturday night in town and didn't return until Sunday afternoon, leaving the plantation unsupervised. The bookkeeper, Franklin Wells, was nearly blind and relied on slaves to read documents aloud, never suspecting Hagar sometimes changed words or numbers. The slave quarters were inspected weekly, always Wednesday mornings, giving plenty of time to hide anything. And the library remained accessible. Charles hadn't changed the locks, believing Ruth's brutal lesson had taught his slaves to stay away. He was wrong. In 1837, when Hagar was 17, Charles Ashford made a decision that sealed his fate. He expanded by purchasing a neighboring plantation, Willow Creek. The acquisition required a significant loan from a Richmond bank, and the loan documents were kept in a locked drawer in his study. Hagar had been watching that drawer for months. She knew which key opened it, where it was kept, and when the study was empty. One night in October, while the household slept, she moved. She didn't take anything that would be noticed immediately. Instead, she read everything, every document, contract, letter. Then she put it all back and returned to her quarters before dawn. What she learned changed everything. The loan documents contained a clause she'd never seen but immediately recognized. If Charles failed to make 3 consecutive payments, the bank could seize not just Willow Creek, but Sweetwater itself, including all assets and slaves. The entire Ashford fortune was leveraged against one acquisition. A tremendous risk. If the tobacco crop failed, if prices dropped, if anything went wrong, he could lose everything. Hagar saw the opportunity immediately, but also the problem. If the plantation failed, the slaves would be sold at auction, scattered, families destroyed. Many might end up far worse. She needed to think strategically, not just destroy this plantation, but build something larger, a network, a system, a weapon that could strike at the heart of slavery itself. And for that, she needed to be sold. It sounds insane. What slave would ever want the auction block, every slave's worst nightmare? But Hagar understood something the masters never did: the greatest power comes from movement. A slave who stayed on one plantation knew only that one, its fields, rhythms, people, but nothing of the larger world. A slave moved from place to place, sold from master to master, could learn what no stationary slave could: map the territory, build connections, find the weak points in the armor. Hagar decided to become that slave. The question was how. Slaves didn't choose when or whether they were sold, that belonged to the master. She needed to make Charles Ashford want to sell her, while ensuring she was sold to someone specific in a place she chose. The answer came from an unlikely source: the overseer's wife. Martha Tate was a bitter, jealous woman who long suspected her husband was taking liberties with female slaves. She was right. Jeremiah Tate was a predator who used his position to assault women. But Martha could never prove it. Confronting him would only bring violence against herself. Hagar saw an opportunity. She began leaving evidence for Martha to find, a torn piece of fabric from a slave woman's dress in Jeremiah's pocket, scratches on his back, whispered rumors reaching Martha through house slaves. Martha's jealousy grew into rage. She made her husband's life miserable, accused him of infidelity, threatened to leave, demanded he get rid of the women he suspected. Jeremiah Tate, a weak man who couldn't stand up to his wife, began looking for scapegoats. Hagar made sure she was one, became clumsy in her work, broke tools, spilled water, made small mistakes that drew attention. She made sure to be nearby whenever Martha was watching, cultivating a look that could be interpreted as defiance or desire, depending on the observer. And she muttered in Latin just loud enough to be overheard. Within 3 months, Jeremiah had convinced Charles Ashford that Hagar was too dangerous to keep, not because of her size or strength, but her mind, speaking strange languages, rumors of unnatural abilities, knowing things she shouldn't. In the spring of 1838, Hagar Ashford was sold for the first time. She was purchased by Thomas Redford, who owned a medium-sized tobacco plantation about 40 miles from Sweetwater. Hagar had researched him thoroughly. His plantation bordered 3 others, he had connections to traders who moved slaves between Virginia and Kentucky, and he had a gambling problem eating away his fortune. His library, while smaller, contained something Sweetwater's didn't, a complete set of Virginia legal codes. Hagar had a plan, to learn the law so thoroughly she could use it as a weapon, find every loophole, ambiguity, vulnerability, and exploit them all. But first, she had to survive. Thomas Redford wasn't like Charles Ashford, not a gentleman who prided himself on humane treatment. He was desperate, drowning in debt, seeing slaves as assets to squeeze for every drop of value. He worked them dawn to long after dark, provided minimal food and clothing, used the whip liberally. He had a particular interest in Hagar, not sexual, thankfully, but he'd heard rumors about her strange abilities and evil nature. He bought her specifically to break her, prove there was nothing special. He had no idea what he was dealing with. Hagar spent her first month learning rhythms and routines, working hard, keeping her head down, giving no sign of the fire inside. She let Thomas Redford believe she was just another slave, broken and terrified. But at night, while others slept, she read. His library was locked, but locks meant nothing. She taught herself to pick them, using techniques from a book on metallurgy and mechanical engineering. She could open any lock on the plantation in under a minute, silently. Every night, for hours, she sat in that dark study, reading by moonlight, filling her mind with Virginia's laws, property rights, contract law, deeds and transfers, legal definitions of slavery, circumstances for freedom, courts and judges, the endless bureaucracy. She began to see the cracks. The legal system was vast and complex, but also old and inconsistent, laws contradicted each other, definitions varied by county, enforcement was sporadic and corrupt. Most importantly, the system relied on the assumption that slaves were illiterate and ignorant, could never understand the laws, let alone exploit them. Hagar was going to prove that assumption catastrophically wrong. But she wasn't going to do it alone. She needed allies, a network. To build that, she needed to be sold again. This time, she didn't need to be subtle. Thomas Redford was already suspicious, looking for an excuse. All she needed was to give him one. She chose fire, not large, not dangerous, just a small blaze in the tobacco drying barn, started with a candle and dry leaves, easily extinguished. But enough to cause damage, fear, and make Thomas believe the rumors were true. Within a week, she was sold again. This time, she was purchased by a slave trader named Marcus Webb, who planned to take her south to Alabama's cotton markets. But Hagar had no intention of going. She knew Marcus Webb's secret: he was illiterate. He'd built his business on bluster and intimidation, hiding his inability to read so well almost no one knew. He had partners for paperwork, clerks to read aloud, an elaborate system of symbols instead of written records. Hagar saw the opportunity. On the second night south, while others were chained in the wagon and Marcus slept by the fire, she worked her way out of her chains using a technique taught herself years ago. She approached silently, a stolen knife in hand, pressed it to his throat before he could wake. "I know you can't read," she said quietly. "And I know what that means for your business. If your partners find out, your buyers, you'll be ruined. Everything you've built will be gone." His eyes went wide with terror. No slave had ever spoken to him like this, held a knife to his throat. He was completely at her mercy. "I'm going to make you an offer," she continued. "You'll sell me to William Garrett in Henrico County. You'll tell him I'm strong, obedient, perfect for fieldwork. You'll forget you ever saw me. In exchange, I won't tell your secret, destroy your business, or cut your throat right now. Do we have a deal?" He nodded frantically. "Good. Now put the chains back on me. We have a long way to travel." William Garrett was not a random choice. He was the third name on a list Hagar had been compiling for years, the most powerful and most vulnerable slave owners in Virginia. Each name was a step in a plan only she could see. Charles Ashford was first, the man who destroyed her family, whose plantation she knew better than he did. Thomas Redford second, a gambler, easy to manipulate, useful for information. William Garrett was third because he was Charles Ashford's cousin, had helped arrange Ruth's sale to the Deep South, and his plantation was the hub of a network connecting a dozen of Virginia's largest slaveholding families. Hagar wasn't moving randomly, she was climbing a ladder, closer to power, gathering information and connections at every step. When she reached the top, she was going to push the whole thing down. But first, she had to survive William Garrett. William Garrett was the worst kind of master, intelligent and cruel, patient and vicious, taking pleasure in breaking spirits. He didn't use the whip for punishment, he used it for entertainment. He didn't sell troublesome slaves, he tortured them until they died or went mad. And he'd heard the stories about Hagar. When Marcus Webb delivered her, William was waiting at the gate, tall, thin, with pale blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. He looked at her the way a scientist examines a specimen, calculating in cold. "So this is the famous Hagar," he said. "The slave who destroys everything she touches. Speaks in tongues, reads forbidden books, knows things she shouldn't." He walked around her slowly. "You don't look special. Big, strong, useful for heavy labor. But there's something in your eyes, isn't there? Something the others don't have. I'm going to enjoy finding out what it is, and destroying it." Hagar said nothing, eyes lowered, face blank, body still. She'd learned the best defense against men like William was to give them nothing, no fear, no anger, no defiance. Just emptiness. He frowned, expected more, got nothing. "Take her to the quarters," he told the overseer. "Put her in the fields. Watch her every moment. I want to know everything she does." As she was led away, she caught one last glimpse of his face and saw something that made her blood run cold. He wasn't just cruel, but intelligent. He suspected more to her, was determined to find out, would watch, study, test, look for any sign of weakness or deception. This was the most dangerous game she'd ever played. The stakes, her life. The next 3 years were the hardest of Hagar's existence. William Garrett watched constantly, tested her in 100 ways, asking questions only a literate person could answer, leaving books where she might find them, setting traps to reveal her true nature. Hagar evaded them all. She had years of practice hiding her intelligence, played dumb, pretended confusion at simple questions, handled books like strange alien objects, even made mistakes in work a smart person never would, reinforcing the impression she was just a strong, stupid field hand. But it was exhausting. Constant vigilance, endless deception, the knowledge a single slip meant torture and death. There were nights she lay in her tiny cabin wondering if it was worth it, nights she thought about giving up, letting him win, accepting she'd die on this plantation like so many others. But then she'd think of her mother, Ruth, who'd risked everything to give her the gift of knowledge, the wagon disappearing, the promise she'd made. And she'd get up the next day and keep fighting. During those 3 years, Hagar accomplished something remarkable. Despite constant surveillance, she built the beginnings of a network. She identified trustworthy slaves willing to take risks, taught them signals and codes, ways of communicating that looked like normal behavior to anyone else. She began mapping connections between plantations, roads traveled, people who could be bribed or manipulated. And she learned things about William Garrett he would have killed to keep secret. He was deeply in debt to a Richmond bank, his wife was having an affair with the local minister, he'd forged documents to claim land belonging to his neighbor, he'd killed a slave 3 years earlier and covered it up. Each piece filed away in that perfect memory, waiting to be used. That moment came in the fall of 1841. William had finally found what he thought was proof of Hagar's literacy. A slave from a neighboring plantation, caught with a book, confessed under torture that Hagar had taught him to read. It was a lie, Hagar had never seen him, but William didn't care about truth, he cared about finally breaking her. He called her to the main house, confronted her with the accusation, described the punishment. Then sat back, waiting for her to beg, confess, break. Instead, Hagar did something he never expected, she smiled. "You're going to sell me," she said, voice calm. "You're going to take me to the Richmond auction tomorrow morning, sell me to the highest bidder, and do it quietly without telling anyone why." William stared in disbelief. "Why would I do that?" "Because I know about the bank," she said. "How much you owe, when payments are due. If you don't come up with $3,000 in 30 days, you'll lose everything." She paused, watching color drain from his face. "I know about the land you stole, the slave you killed, and your wife and Reverend Whitmore." His hands were shaking. "How? How do you?" "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that I know. If you don't sell me tomorrow, quietly and without questions, I'll make sure everyone else knows too, your creditors, neighbors, sheriff, wife." She leaned forward, letting him see what was in her eyes. "You're not going to break me, Mr. Garrett. I'm going to break you, slowly, over many years, after I've moved on. You'll never know when or where the blow comes. You'll just wake up one day and find everything you've built crumble to dust." She smiled again. "Unless you let me go now. Then maybe, just maybe, I'll forget what I know. Maybe I'll let you keep your pathetic little kingdom a few more years. Maybe." William looked at her, face pale, hands trembling. He'd broken hundreds of slaves, never been broken by one. Until now. "Get out," he whispered. "Get out of my house." The next morning, Hagar was on her way to the Richmond slave market. William Garrett never spoke of her again to anyone for as long as he lived. Hagar Ashford, the giant who broke the chains. Part 2. The Richmond slave market in the fall of 1841 was one of the largest human trafficking operations in the Western Hemisphere. A complex near the waterfront, it processed thousands of enslaved people every year, sending them to cotton fields in Alabama and Mississippi, rice plantations in South Carolina, sugar farms in Louisiana. A machine designed to destroy families and extract profit from suffering, operated with cold efficiency. Hagar had been through slave markets but never this large. The holding pen stretched for hundreds of feet, crowded with men, women, and children waiting to be sold. Air thick with unwashed bodies and weeping. Families pressed together, knowing within hours they might be torn apart, mothers clutching babies, hoping some buyer would take them as a group. Hagar watched with calculating eyes, taking in layout, guard schedules, faces of traders and buyers. She listened to conversations, picking up prices, destinations, powerful owners. And she began connecting dots. In the holding pen next to hers stood a man named Solomon, about 50, gray hair, deep lines around his eyes. For 30 years, he'd been a blacksmith on a North Carolina plantation, skilled enough his master hired him out, but his master died, and Solomon was now at market like any other property. Solomon could read, not fluently, just basic words and numbers, but enough to be useful. More importantly, he knew people. Over 3 decades, he'd worked across farms in North Carolina and Virginia, building relationships with hundreds of enslaved people, knowing who could be trusted, who took risks, who had skills for organized resistance. Hagar recognized his value at once. She approached carefully, using honed signals and codes, a certain way of positioning hands, words that sounded ordinary but carried hidden meanings, questions revealing whether the listener was ally or threat. Solomon understood, he'd seen similar codes in whispered resistance networks. He responded with his own signals, confirming trust, ready to join whatever Hagar was planning. They talked for hours that night, voices low in the darkness. Hagar told him part of her plan, not all, but enough to grasp the scale: a network across Virginia, mapping connections between plantations, identifying system vulnerabilities, preparing a strike that would shake slavery. Solomon listened in silence, eyes widening. "You're either the smartest person I've ever met," he said finally, "or the craziest." "Does it matter?" Hagar asked. "Maybe both." He shook his head. "What do you need from me?" "Contacts. Trustworthy people in North Carolina. Routes between plantations. Information on traders moving slaves between states. Anything that might help." For the next 3 hours, Solomon talked, dozens of names, descriptions of each person, skills, locations, roads slave coffles traveled, stops, opportunities for communication, underground networks already existing, secret churches and midnight meetings. Hagar filed it all away, every name, route, piece of information. By sunrise, she'd added hundreds of new data points to the mental map she was building. That morning, Solomon was sold to a cotton planter from Alabama. Hagar never saw him again, but the information proved invaluable in years to come, extending her network far beyond Virginia. Hagar herself was bought by Robert Cunningham, who owned a small tobacco farm in Hanover County. He wasn't cruel, just ordinary, unremarkable, worked his slaves hard but didn't abuse, provided adequate food and shelter, rarely used the whip. Exactly the kind of master she needed, someone who wouldn't watch too closely, giving her freedom to keep building her network. She spent 2 years on the Cunningham farm, making more progress than in all the years before. The farm sat at a crossroads where major roads intersected, travelers constantly passed, slave traders moving coffles, peddlers, free black people on business. Each traveler was potential information, a potential link. She developed a system: find reasons to be near the road, offer water or food in exchange for conversation, ask innocent-sounding questions about conditions elsewhere, about people she claimed to know, news from the wider world. Every detail filed away. By the end of her second year, Hagar had established connections with enslaved people on over 40 plantations across Virginia and North Carolina. She'd identified 17 individuals willing to take significant risks for freedom. She'd mapped routes between every major regional slave market. And she'd begun developing something more ambitious than a simple escape network, an intelligence operation. Every piece of information was analyzed and catalogued: which masters were in financial trouble, which plantations had weak security, which traders corrupt enough to bribe, patrol schedules, safe house locations. She taught others to do the same, using codes and signals, training contacts to gather and transmit information, establishing dead drops and secret messages so information could travel hundreds of miles without direct contact. A remarkable achievement, accomplished by enslaved people forbidden to read, travel, gather, or do anything threatening their master's power. But Hagar knew it wasn't enough. Information was power, but only if used. She needed access to centers of power, to be close to decision-makers. She needed to be sold again. In the spring of 1843, Hagar engineered her 5th sale. She'd learned from William Garrett that the best way to control her destiny was to create situations forcing masters to sell her. On the Cunningham farm, she used a subtler approach, displaying knowledge a slave shouldn't have, correcting the overseer's arithmetic, predicting weather with uncanny accuracy, mentioning distant events impossible to know through normal means. The Cunningham family became convinced she was a witch, a belief common in rural Virginia, where many white people, despite Christianity, harbored deep superstitions about enslaved Africans' supernatural powers. They were terrified of having such a person in their household. Robert Cunningham sold her at the first opportunity, relieved to be rid of her before she brought a curse. She was sold to a trader named James Monroe, no relation to the former president, who specialized in purchasing troublesome slaves and reselling them to buyers who didn't know their histories. James Monroe was exactly the man she needed, connected to every major slave market in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, knew every plantation owner, buyer, seller, possessed information about the slave trade few others had, and could be manipulated. Hagar spent 6 months with him, traveling with coffles from market to market. A brutal existence, coffles walked miles every day, chained, fed just enough to keep moving. Many died from exhaustion, disease, despair. But for Hagar, it was an opportunity. She used those 6 months to map the entire slave trade network of the Upper South, every major buyer and seller's name, locations, preferences, financial situations, routes between markets, auction schedules, prices different types commanded, weak points where the system could be disrupted. And she made more connections. Each coffle contained enslaved people from different plantations, states, backgrounds, each a potential link in her network, carrier of information, ally in the war she was waging. By the time James Monroe sold her, Hagar had contacts on over 100 plantations across 4 states, trained over 50 people in her codes and signals, created an intelligence network spanning thousands of square miles. And she was just getting started. Her 6th sale took her to a plantation in Louisa County owned by Frederick Holmes. Holmes was a lawyer as well as a plantation owner, and his study held something Hagar had searched for years, a complete collection of court records and legal documents relating to slavery in Virginia. This was the treasure she'd been seeking. Court records showed how the law worked in practice, interpreted, applied, bent, broken. Details no law book could provide. For 2 years, Hagar studied those records with the intensity she'd once applied to Blackstone and Cicero. She learned about every slavery-related case decided in Virginia courts, precedents, exceptions, technicalities, loopholes, cases where slaves had been freed on technical grounds, wills contested, property transfers challenged. And she found something extraordinary, a precedent from 1812, apparently forgotten by the legal profession. The case involved a slave named James, promised freedom in his master's will, then sold to another owner before the master died. The new owner claimed sale nullified the promise. The court disagreed, ruling a promise of freedom once made and witnessed could not be revoked by subsequent sale. The promise followed the person, not the property. The implications were staggering. If a slave owner could be induced to promise freedom to an enslaved person, and that promise witnessed and documented, it was legally binding, even if the slave was later sold. Hagar immediately saw how this could be used: get slave owners to make promises, document them, use their own words against them. But she needed more cases, exceptions, technicalities, a legal arsenal to attack slavery from within. She spent another 6 months on the Holmes plantation, studying every document she could. Then arranged to be sold again. Her 7th, 8th, and 9th sales followed a similar pattern, each time targeting a specific plantation for a specific reason, a plantation with connections to the political establishment, near a major transportation hub, owned by a family with legislative influence. At each stop, she gathered more information, made more connections, trained more people. At each stop, she moved closer to the center of power. By 1850, Hagar had been sold 9 times. She was 30, though she looked older. Years of hard labor and stress had taken their toll on her body. But her mind was sharper than ever, and her network had grown to contacts on over 200 plantations across 5 states. She was ready for the next phase of her plan. Her 10th sale took her to Henrico County, to a plantation called Oak Hill. The owner was Thomas Ashford. The name was no coincidence. Thomas was the son of Charles Ashford, the man who destroyed Hagar's family 20 years earlier, beaten her mother, sold her to the Deep South, set Hagar on this path of vengeance. Thomas had inherited Sweetwater after his father's death in 1845, but Sweetwater wasn't enough. He wanted to build an empire. Over the previous 5 years, he'd acquired 6 additional plantations, consolidated holdings into one of Virginia's largest slave-owning operations with over 800 enslaved people. He'd established connections with banks, politicians, traders throughout the South, become one of the most powerful men in the state. He had no idea the woman just sold to his plantation was the same girl who'd stood in his father's library 20 years ago, reading Cicero in Latin. Hagar was different now. 2 decades of hard labor had changed her body, constant stress had changed her face. She was still tall, still imposing, but the girl who'd watched her mother being taken away was long gone. In her place stood a woman hardened by decades of struggle, who'd seen things that would break most people, transformed into something Thomas Ashford couldn't recognize. But Hagar recognized him. She saw his father's eyes, heard his father's voice. When she looked at him, she saw the man who destroyed her family resurrected in new flesh. The circle was almost complete. Hagar spent the next 2 years on Oak Hill, working as a field hand and watching Thomas carefully. She learned his routines, habits, weaknesses, business dealings, financial situation, other plantations, and their managers. And she began to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. Thomas Ashford's empire was vast, but vulnerable, expanded too quickly, borrowed too much, dependent on volatile tobacco, stretched thin managing 6 properties with limited resources. More importantly, his record-keeping was a mess. Rapid expansion created chaos in documentation, property records incomplete, sales contradictory, ownership documents scattered across half a dozen locations. Hagar saw the opportunity. In a system dependent on documentation, incomplete and contradictory records were a fatal weakness. If documents could be lost or altered, ownership challenged, the paper trail disrupted, the entire system could be thrown into chaos. And Hagar knew exactly how. For the next 2 years, she worked patiently. She identified where Thomas kept records, studied formats and styles, learned to forge his signatures so perfectly even he couldn't tell the difference. She began making copies of key documents, altering them in subtle ways not noticed immediately but causing legal problems later. She continued building her network. Oak Hill was the hub, and enslaved people from all 6 plantations passed through regularly, allowing her to expand contacts, share information, coordinate the next phase. By 1852, everything was in place: contacts on every Thomas Ashford plantation, forged documents challenging ownership of hundreds of enslaved people, allies positioned throughout the county, and a plan that would bring his empire crashing down. But then something happened that almost destroyed everything. In the summer of 1852, Thomas Ashford decided to sell Oak Hill. He'd overextended financially and needed to liquidate. Oak Hill was his most valuable property, selling it would solve immediate problems. But selling Oak Hill meant selling all the enslaved people who lived there, including Hagar. This was a disaster. Hagar had spent 2 years positioning herself at the center of Thomas's empire. All her plans depended on accessing his records, communicating with other plantations, executing her strategy from within his organization. If she was sold to a stranger, everything would be thrown into chaos. She had to stop the sale. But how? She couldn't blackmail Thomas the way she blackmailed William Garrett. Thomas was too powerful, too well connected. If she threatened him, he'd simply have her killed or sold to a trader heading for the Deep South. She needed a different approach. The answer came from an unexpected source: Thomas Ashford's wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a woman of contradictions. Raised in wealthy Charleston, surrounded by enslaved servants her whole life, she accepted slavery without question. But she was also deeply religious, a devout Presbyterian who took her faith seriously, and she was troubled. The rapid expansion of her husband's holdings disturbed her. She'd watched families torn apart to staff new plantations, seen the brutality required to control so many people. She'd begun wondering if the institution she'd accepted all her life was truly compatible with her Christianity. Hagar sensed this uncertainty and decided to exploit it. She began finding ways to interact with Elizabeth, offering help around the main house, making herself useful in small ways. She was careful never to seem too intelligent or capable, presenting herself as a simple, pious woman who'd found comfort and faith despite hardships. And she began planting seeds. Mentioned casually she prayed for her masters every night, quote Bible verses about mercy and compassion, tell stories about other enslaved people she'd known, stories emphasizing their humanity, faith, hopes, dreams. Slowly, over months, Elizabeth began to see enslaved people differently, not as property, but as people, not as problems, but as souls to be saved. When Thomas announced his plan to sell Oak Hill, Elizabeth objected. She didn't want families torn apart, didn't want responsibility for sending people she'd come to know to uncertain fates. Thomas was surprised. Elizabeth had never questioned his business decisions before, but she was insistent. After weeks of argument, they reached a compromise. Oak Hill would be sold, but the enslaved people would be distributed among Thomas's other plantations rather than sold on the open market. It wasn't perfect. Hagar would still be moved from Oak Hill, but she'd remain within Thomas's empire, able to continue her work. She was transferred to Sweetwater. The irony wasn't lost on her. 20 years after being sold away from the plantation where she was born, Hagar was returning. But she wasn't the same person. She was a general now, commanding an army of allies and information, preparing for the final battle of a war that had lasted most of her life. Sweetwater had changed. Charles Ashford was dead, his son had transformed it into headquarters of a larger operation. New buildings, expanded fields, enlarged quarters. But some things stayed the same. The library where Hagar had taught herself to read was still there, though books had been moved, the whipping post where her mother had been beaten still stood, and the road down which Ruth had disappeared was still visible, a dusty line stretching toward a horizon Hagar had never stopped watching. She found the tree where she'd stood on that terrible morning, watching the wagon carry her mother away. She touched the bark, feeling years compressed into that rough surface. And she made a new vow, to the ghost of the girl she'd once been, I'm back. And I'm going to finish what I started. Her 11th sale came in 1854, when Thomas decided to move workers to a newly acquired plantation in Chesterfield County. Hagar was among those transferred, but by this point, it didn't matter where she was. Her network spanned all Thomas's plantations, forged documents in place, allies positioned. Everything ready for the final phase. She spent the next 2 years refining preparations, making sure every piece was in place. She verified her forged documents would hold up under scrutiny, confirmed allies knew their roles, studied legal procedures required to challenge ownership claims. And she waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in the winter of 1856, when Thomas Ashford did something that played directly into her hands. He decided to consolidate all ownership records in one location. Thomas had finally realized scattered documentation was creating problems, trouble proving ownership, issues with insurance and estate planning. So he ordered all records from all 6 plantations gathered at Sweetwater, organized and verified. It was exactly the opportunity Hagar had been waiting for. The consolidation took months. Documents transported from all over Virginia, collected at Sweetwater, stored in a new records room adjacent to the main house. Thomas hired a team of clerks to sort through papers and create a master registry of all enslaved holdings. Hagar was assigned to assist the clerks, a strange assignment for a field hand, but she'd cultivated a reputation as reliable, trustworthy. The clerks needed physical labor. Hagar was strong enough, and she seemed simple-minded. They had no idea what they were inviting into their midst. For 3 months, Hagar worked alongside the clerks, carrying boxes of documents back and forth, watching them organize records, listening to legal technicalities. And every night after clerks went home, she worked alone. She replaced documents with forged versions prepared years earlier, altered dates and signatures, created contradictions to call ownership into question, inserted documents that had never existed, papers promising freedom, challenging legitimacy of sales, throwing the registry into chaos. And she did something else, something that would prove the most devastating blow of all. She created a set of documents that, if accepted as genuine, would legally transfer ownership of 847 enslaved people to themselves. It was an audacious forgery. The documents purported to be manumission agreements signed by Thomas Ashford over years, promising freedom in exchange for loyal service. In November 1856, Thomas Ashford's second-largest plantation caught fire. Started in the tobacco drying barn, spread to the main house before contained. Records not yet transferred to Sweetwater were destroyed. 1 month later, a series of suspicious accidents plagued his Louisa County plantation: tools sabotaged, crops damaged, livestock escaped through mysteriously opened gates. The overseer quit. Thomas was forced to spend weeks personally managing. In January 1857, his bank called in a loan not due for another 2 years, claiming documents showed earlier due date. Thomas insisted wrong, but when he searched for his copy of the original agreement, he couldn't find it. These were not coincidences. Each orchestrated by Hagar's network, executed by allies positioned over years of careful planning. Goal: distract Thomas, keep him off balance, prevent attention to what was happening in the records room. It worked. By spring 1857, and Hagar Ashford disappeared. Her 12th and final sale had never actually happened. She'd been among the 847 freed by the court ruling. She walked off Sweetwater plantation on that August day in 1857, 40 years after she'd first arrived as an infant. But she didn't stay in Virginia. She knew there were people who suspected her involvement, who'd try to find her, seek revenge. So she vanished, using the network she'd built to escape north beyond reach of slave catchers and angry former masters. Some say she made it to Canada. Others say she settled in a free black community in Ohio or Pennsylvania. A few claim she returned to Virginia during the Civil War, helping the Union Army identify Confederate supply routes and communication networks. The truth: no one knows what happened to Hagar Ashford after she walked off that plantation. She left no letters, no diaries, no records of any kind. The woman who'd spent her life creating and manipulating documents made sure there would be no documents about herself. But her legacy lived on. The 847 people she freed became the nucleus of a thriving free black community in Virginia and beyond. They built churches and schools, started businesses and farms, raised families and told stories about the woman who'd set them free. And they continued her work. The network Hagar built didn't disappear when she did. It evolved and expanded, becoming part of the larger movement known as the Underground Railroad. The codes and signals she developed taught to new generations, connections she'd established continued functioning, helping enslaved people escape to freedom throughout years leading to the Civil War. By the time the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, Hagar Ashford's network had helped an estimated 2,000 people escape to freedom. Her legacy extended far beyond the 847 she'd directly freed. But perhaps the most important part of her legacy was something less tangible. Hagar Ashford proved the system could be beaten, not by force, not by violence, but by intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. She showed that an enslaved person, denied every opportunity for education, could teach herself to read and write and think more clearly than any master. She demonstrated the legal system designed to perpetuate slavery could be turned against itself. She revealed the chains of bondage weren't iron, but paper, and paper could destroy them. She was sold 12 times because they feared her mind. They never imagined that with every sale she was building the weapon that would defeat them. The last known words attributed to Hagar Ashford come from a letter supposedly written to a member of her network shortly after her escape from Virginia. The letter has never been authenticated, and its current location is unknown, but the words have been passed down through generations, a message from a woman who spent her life fighting for freedom. They tried to make me an animal. They denied me the words that make us human. They sold me like livestock, beat me like a beast, worked me like a machine. But they forgot something important. They forgot the mind cannot be chained. They forgot knowledge once acquired can never be taken away. They forgot that every blow, every sale, every cruelty only sharpened my purpose and strengthened my resolve. I was sold 12 times. 12 times they tried to break me. 12 times they failed. And in the end, I broke them. The chains are made of paper. Remember that. The power they hold over us is written in books, recorded in registers, filed in courthouses. It seems solid, permanent, unbreakable. But paper burns, paper tears, paper can be forged and altered and lost. The chains that bind us are more fragile than they appear, if only we have the wisdom to see their weaknesses and the courage to exploit them. I was just one woman. I had no army, no weapons, no power. All I had was my mind, my patience, and my unwavering determination to be free. With those tools, I brought down an empire. If I can do it, so can you. Anyone who refuses to accept their humanity is less than another's. Anyone who understands freedom is not a gift given but a right taken. They sold me 12 times, and I destroyed them 12 times over. Remember me. Remember what I did. And never, ever stop fighting. The letter is signed simply, Hagar. Today, in a small cemetery in Henrico County, Virginia, there is a weathered stone marker among the graves of enslaved people who lived and died on the Ashford plantations, people whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, whose lives were considered property rather than history. The marker bears no name. It was placed there in 1892 by a group of elderly men and women who'd been among the 847 freed by Hagar's plan. They couldn't find her grave, didn't know where or when she'd died, but they wanted something to mark her existence. The inscription on the marker is short, just 5 words carved into stone. She remembered. She returned. She freed. Below those words is a symbol few today would recognize, one of the codes Hagar developed, a marker network used to identify safe places and trusted people. It means, roughly translated, the way is open. Pass in safety. Visitors to the cemetery sometimes leave flowers at the marker. They don't know who's commemorated there, don't know the story of the woman sold 12 times who destroyed her masters 12 times over. They don't know about the network she built, the documents she forged, the 847 lives she saved. But something about that marker speaks to them, something about those 5 words resonates in a way they can't explain. She remembered. She returned. She freed. In a world that tried to erase her, Hagar Ashford wrote herself into history. And she did it with the very tools they thought they could deny her. She did it with words.